Now, first of all, we're going to talk about Tuam, which, you know, Tuam. No greater hoax probably has been inflicted on the Irish people in the last few years, other than the Civita hoax, in order to turn them away from the Catholic Church. Now, look, there's a very good video on YouTube which exposes this and how the lie began, and the notion that this was an unmarked grave, which it was not. We need to set that straight. There were headstones at that grave, which Galway County Council bulldozed away. And if you watch this video, it's very clear how Catherine Corliss, at the beginning of this, when the narrative began, she spoke about this, and then it was as if she was silenced. Do not mention the fact that there were headstones and crosses at this grave. That's never to be said again. And she stopped saying that. What do you make of this? This was all done to whip people into such a frenzy.
Well, I have to admit, from the word go, I didn't believe the story. Yeah. I happen to have done a bit of study on how the church buried people. So as soon as I heard this story about all the little bodies wrapped up and on shelving, I said, catacombs. We've always kept our dead with us. We've respected the burial place because we are awaiting the resurrection. But there's a whole generation of elitists in our country who clearly know nothing about the Catholic faith, about its depth and its refinement and its history, how things evolved. So people were ready to accept anything they were told, the narrative as they call it. And they didn't have anything to fall back on and say, oh wait, now, hold on a second. The way we buried people has had a history, and there have been changes in history. At first, of course, the place where Mass was said was in the catacombs beside the bodies of the martyrs. But when the church emerged free and was building churches around the place, bodies were not acceptable into the church, and certainly not into the sanctuary. It took a long struggle for people to be buried in the church. Most of the squares of towns in the Mediterranean countries, there's the church, there's the square, and then there's the public buildings. The public buildings came later. The church was built, and the space in front of the church were where people were buried, awaiting the resurrection. And that's why Irish people still held to being buried in old cemeteries, because they reckoned if the monks were going to rise, that they had a chance of rising with them. But there's quite a complex history to do with the understanding of death and decay. It all came to light when churchyards in cities were too small to take all the dead that were dying, and the authorities, the civil authorities, then started building what was known as garden cemeteries, like Glasnevin. And they were built in such a way that people would come out of the town and picnic beside the graves of their relatives. So there's a whole complex history. And when I heard the Tuam baby thing being written up by an amateur historian, now we've all done a little bit of historic research, and we jump to conclusions because somebody describes something in a particular way and it's out of context. We have to be very careful when we talk about the past and how people perceive things. But I didn't believe that story.
And you did further. So you didn't believe it. On what grounds? I mean, I actually, a bit like Civita, when they do this, I just can't. Sometimes I just can't listen. If I hear Tuam babies being discussed, I just don't want to hear it because I know it's going to be a hatchet job on the church. And you know, those nuns have suffered so much, and yet you hear stories of how wonderful they were, and you know how family members of people who were there in that facility, said that they were treated so well, and these women.
My first appointment as a priest, 1969, was to a home for unmarried mothers. And that home was kept very well. I would hear the confessions of the girls, because they were mostly girls. And I was asking questions as I was hearing their stories, and I formed the impression that they fell foul of sexuality. That driving force, remember, is not just an independent free choice. They fell foul because they had a poor image of a man, either their fathers or their boyfriends. The nuns were wise, and they said, "Father, the men that come in with the bouquet of flowers and the box of chocolates for the girl, they're the married ones. The single ones who may be required to marry them hardly come in at all." Mm-hmm. So there's another side to this story, that we're told they were the poor victims. Yeah, they were victims. They were victims of not being formed in a grouping, like a family or a parish, for proper sexual understanding. Mm. And they allowed themselves to be carried away. Now, one of the things that I experienced there in the home, the nuns brought me over to the special unit where they kept babies who were being left there because the mothers couldn't decide what to do with them. Now, maybe they had genuine reasons, or maybe they were just being awkward. But what I noticed, remember, I'm just a raw recruit at this stage. I didn't know so many things coming straight from the seminary, but I did spot in the row of cots, and this dormitory was immaculate, beautifully kept, no smells. In fact, the abiding smell was Pond's talc, or Johnson's baby talc. That's the abiding smell in that place.
And Dettol, probably.
No, not the Dettol, but the Pond's.
No, okay.
But I noticed that the babies, they were now able kind of to sit up. They were there quite a while. That they were rocking. I couldn't understand this. And some of them that had hair, the hair was matted at the back of their head. And I said, "Sister, why are they doing that? And why is their hair like that?" Oh, she said, "They're rocking themselves to replace the rocking that the mother should do to the child." So I think we should be very hesitant about condemning people and judging them in the care that they were given.
Yeah, I mean, it's, and again, the state outsourced all of this to the nuns, to the Catholic Church. It was the job of the state, arguably. It was the job of the families, first and foremost, to look after these women. Yeah. And, that's another story. But, I was